Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. The last few streams I've had some issues. We didn't restart the router last time I streamed. My fiance did say I have a little like extender thing in my room for the internet, and maybe it's that needs resetting because our router seems to be okay, but that might need resetting. So I'm gonna write down to do that. Because the thing is, it happens during stream, and then I end the stream, and then I forget to do it. Because I'm a smart cookie sometimes. I am. So, reset room Wi-Fi extender. Yeah, there we go. That should work. I'd love to be Etherneted to the actual router, but we can't do that because I'm too far away. But I am Etherneted to the extender thingy-majigger we got. So that makes it a little bit more stable, but not quite stable enough. Hello, welcome back! Welcome back, Arcady Guy. Welcome back, Nomisized Phantom. Let's continue reading. Well, Elizabeth, let's go from here. I don't know exactly when I disconnected. So we'll go from Elizabeth was now having to see Mr. Wickham. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. Having been frequently in company with him since her return, agitation was pretty well over. The agitations of former partiality entirely so. Went and got a drink, came back to end a stream, lol. Hello again, hello, I get jump a hop. Yep, sorry to jump scare you like that. I need to do some internet things, because this has happened too many streams in a row now. She had even learned to detect, in the very gentleness which had first delighted her, an affection and sameness to disgust and weary. In his present behaviour to herself, moreover, she had a fresh source of displeasure, for the inclination he soon testified of renewing those attentions which had marked the early part of their acquaintance could only serve, after what had since passed, to provoke her. She lost all concern for him in finding herself thus selected as the object of such idle and frivolous gallantry, and while she steadily repressed it, could not but feel the reproof contained in his believing that however long, and for whatever cause, his attentions had been withdrawn, her vanity would be gratified, and her preference secured at any time by their renewal. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining in Merton, he dined, with others of the officers, at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humour, that, on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time passed at Hunsford, he mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy's, having both spent 3 weeks at Rostings, and asked him if he were acquainted with the former. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but, with a moment's recollection and a returning smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often, and, after observing that he was a very gentlemanlike man, asked her how she had liked him. Her answer was warmly in his favour, and, with an air of indifference, he soon added afterwards, "How long did you say he was at Rostings?" "Nearly 3 weeks." "And you saw him frequently?" "Yes, almost every day." "His manners are very different from his cousin's." "Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance." "Indeed!" cried Wickham, with a look which did not escape her. "And pray may I ask—" But checking himself, he added in a gayer tone, Is it in address that he improves? Has he denied to add aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope," he continued in a lower and more serious voice, "that he is improved in essentials." "Oh, no," said Elizabeth. "In essentials, I believe, he is very much what he ever was." While she spoke, Wickham looked as if scarcely knowing whether to rejoice over her words or to distrust her meaning. There was something in her countenance which made him listen with an apprehensive and anxious attention, while she added, "When I said he improved in acquaintance, I did not mean that either his mind or manners were in a state of improvement, but that, from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood." Wickham's alarm now appearing in a heightened complexion and agitated look, for a few minutes he was silent, till, shaking off his embarrassment, he turned to her again, and said in the gentlest of accents, "You, who so well know my feelings towards Mr. Darcy, will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he is wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right. His pride in that direction may be of service, if not to himself, to many others, for it must deter him from such foul misconduct as I have suffered by. I only fear that the sort of cautiousness to which you, I imagine, have been alluding, is merely adopted on his visits to his aunt. Of those good opinions and judgment he stands much in a way. His fear of her always operated, I know, when they were together, and a good deal is to be imputed to his wish of forwarding the march with Miss de Bourgh, which I am certain he has very much at heart." Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. She saw that that he wanted to engage her on the old subject of his grievances, and she was in no humour to indulge him. The rest of the evening passed with the appearance, on his side, of the usual cheerfulness, but with no further attempt to distinguish Elizabeth, and they parted with mutual civility, and possibly a mutual desire of never meeting again. It's like, you know my dirty little secrets now, don't you? Yes, I do, Mr. Wickham. Yes, I do. Shoo. When the party broke up, Lydia returned with Mrs. Foster to Merton, from whence they were to set out early in the morning. The separation between her and her family was rather noisy than pathetic. Kitty was the only one who shed tears, but she did weep from vexation and envy. Mrs. Bennet was diffuse in her good wishes for the felicity of her daughter, and impressive in her injunctions that she could not miss the opportunity of enjoying herself as much as possible. So happy for this one daughter, she's just ignoring the other. Which, given that she, threatened to disown Elizabeth for not marrying Mr. Collins, doesn't surprise me. Advice which there was every reason to believe would be attended to, and, in the clamorous happiness of Lydia herself in bidding farewell, the more genteel adieus of her sister were uttered without being heard. There's a lot of blank pages. What is this? The arrival of the Gardeners. Oh, that's the Friends family. The aunt? I think the aunt house. Had Elizabeth's opinion been drawn from her own family, she could not have formed a very pleasing picture of congenial felicity or domestic comfort. Her father, captivated by youth and beauty, and that appearance of good humour which youth and beauty generally give, had married a woman whose weak understanding and illiberal mind had very early in their marriage put an end to all real affection for her. Oh, good Lord. A loveless marriage. Respect, esteem, and confidence had vanished forever, and all his views of domestic happiness were overthrown. But Mr. Bennet was not of a disposition to seek comfort for the disappointment which his own impudence had brought on in any of those pleasures which too often console the unfortunate for their folly or their vice. He was fond of the country and of books, and from these tastes had arisen his principal enjoyments. To his wife he was very little otherwise indebted than as her ignorance and folly had contributed to his amusement. This is not the sort of happiness which a man would in general wish to owe to his wife, but there were other powers of entertainment are wanting. The true philosopher will derive benefit from such as are given. Go a second. Phone went whoop. Had to check a thing. Elizabeth, however, had never been blind to the impropriety of her father's behaviour as a husband. She had always seen it with pain, but respecting his abilities and grateful for his affectionate treatment of herself, she endeavoured to forget what she could not overlook, and to banish from her thoughts that continual breach of conjugal obligation and decorum which, in exposing his wife to the contempt of her own children, was so highly irreprehensible. But she had never felt so strongly as now the disadvantages which must attend the children of so unsustainable a marriage, nor ever been so fully aware of the evils arising from so ill-judged a direction of talents which, rightly used, might have at least preserved the respectability of his daughters, even if incapable of enlarging the mind of his wife. Yeah, so she's like, Dad, why didn't you pay attention to us more? Dad, the children are incredibly stupid. What did you do? Nothing! Exactly! When Elizabeth had rejoiced over When Elizabeth had rejoiced over Wickham's departure, she found little other cause for satisfaction in the loss of the regiment. Their parties abroad were less varied than before, and at home she had a mother and sister, whose constant repinings at the dullness of everything around them grew a real gloom over their domestic circle, and though Kitty might in time regain her natural degree of sense, since her disturbers of her brain were removed, her sister, from whose disposition greater evil might be apprehended, was likely to be hardened in her folly and assurance by a situation of such double danger as a watering place and a camp. Upon the whole, therefore, she found what has been sometimes found before, that an event to which she had looked forward to with impatience desire did not, in taking place, bring all the satisfaction she had promised herself. It was consequently necessary to name some other period for the commencement of actual felicity, to have some other point on which her wishes and hopes might be fixed, and by again enjoying the pleasure of anticipation, console herself for the present and prepare for another disappointment. Her tour to the lakes was now the object of her happiest thoughts. It was her best consolation for all the uncomfortable hours which her discontentedness of her mother and Kitty made inevitable. And could she have included Jane in the scheme, every part of it would have been perfect. But it is fortunate, thought she, that I have something to wish for. Were the whole arrangement complete, my disappointment would be certain. But here, by carrying with me one ceaseless source of regret in my sister's absence, I may reasonably hope to have all my experiences of pleasure realized. A scheme of which every part promises delight can never be successful, and general disappointment is only warded off by the defence of some little peculiar vexation. That's an interesting way of looking at it. So she's thinking about a holiday, and she's kind of glad that something's already gone wrong, because then she's like, well, something was always going to go wrong. Now something's already gone wrong, so everything else should be fine, right? That's a fascinating way of looking at it. When Lydia went away, she promised to write very often and very minutely to her mother and Kitty, but her letters were always long expected and always very short. Those to her mother contained little else than that they were just returned from the library, where such and such officers had attended them, and where she had seen such beautiful ornaments as made her quite wild. A weird mix of optimism and pessimism. Yeah, it's like taking the pessimism and just being like, oh, well, that's already happened now. That she had a new gown or a new parasol, which she would have described more fully, but was obliged to leave off in a violent hurry, as Mrs. Foster called her, and they were going to the camp. And from her correspondence with her sister there was still less to be learned, for her letters to Kitty, though rather longer, were much too full of lines under the words to be made public. Does that mean she's sending her rude things? Oh my, Lydia, what are you up to? What does that mean? I think that means rude things. After the first fortnight or 3 weeks of her absence, health, good humour, cheerfulness began to reappear at Longbourn. Everything wore a happier aspect. The families who had been in town for the winter came back again, and summer finery and summer engagements arose. Mrs. Bennet was restored to her usual curious serenity, and by the middle of June Kitty was so much recovered as to be able to enter Meryton without any tears, an event of such happy promise as to make Elizabeth hope that by the following Christmas she might be so tolerably reasonable as not to mention an officer above once a day. That she might not be going after these officers so hard that she might not mention them as much. Yay, stupid annoying kid! Unless, by some cruel malicious arrangement at the War Office, another regiment should be quartered at Meryton. The time fixed for the beginning of their northern tour was now fast approaching, and a fortnight only was wanting of it, when a letter arrived from Mrs. Gardiner, which at once delayed its commencement and curtailed its extent. Mr. Gardiner would be prevented by business from setting out till a fortnight later in July, and must be in London again within a month, and as that left too short a period for them to go so far, and see so much as they had proposed, or at least to see it with leisure and comfort they had built on, they were obliged to give up the lakes. Oh no! Lizzie's holiday! And substitute a more contracted tour, and according to the present plan, were to go no farther northward than Derbyshire. In that county there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks, and to Mrs. Gardiner it had peculiarly strong attraction, the town where she had formerly passed some years of her life, and were they were not to spend a few days, as probably as great in an object of her curiosity as to all the celebrated beauties of Matlock, Chatsworth, Dovedale, or the Peak. Derbyshire might as well be Chesham, maybe. Elizabeth was excessively disappointed. She had set her heart on seeing the lakes, and still, though there might have been some time, but it was her business to be satisfied, and certainly her temper to be happy, and all was soon right again. No feelings, no feelings, no feelings, no feelings. With the mention of Derbyshire, there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for her to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, but surely, said she, I enter his county with impunity, and rob it of a few petrified spars without his perceiving me. The period of exacerbation was now doubled. 4 weeks were to pass away before her uncle and aunt's arrival, but they did pass away, and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, with their 4 children, did at length appear at Longbourn. The children, 2 girls of 6 and 8 years old, and 2 boys, were to be left under the particular care of their cousin Jane, who was the general favourite, and whose steady sense and sweetness of temper exactly adapted her for attending to them in every way, teaching them, playing with them, and loving them. The Gardiners stayed only 1 night at Longbourn, and set off the next morning with Elizabeth in pursuit of novelty and amusement. One enjoyment was certain, that of suitableness as companions, a suitableness which comprehended health and temper to bear inconveniences, cheerfulness to enhance every pleasure, and affection and intelligence which might supply it among themselves, if there were disappointments abroad. It is not the object of this work to give a description of Derbyshire, nor of any of the remarkable places through which their route thither lay. Oxford, Benham, Warwick, Kenilworth, Birmingham, etc. are sufficiently known. A small part of Derbyshire is all the present concern. Birmingham. Did you know that there's a... Oh, hello, Taylor, welcome. There's a VTuber con in Birmingham. It wasn't that long ago, actually. I thought about going. But there's a lot of cons in Birmingham. I went to a Comic-Con there. I think my first Comic-Con was in Birmingham. The small part of Derbyshire is all the present concerns. It's so interesting that back then sort of breaking to just talk to the audience wasn't something as looked down on. For example, like it's breaking the whole fiction for a hot minute. Just to go, oh yeah, I'm not going to describe these places. Like, Longbourn's all we care about. That's why Hololive found Elizabeth Bloodflame, maybe. Unless that's actually real. I don't know if that's a real lore thing or not. To the little town of Lambton, the scene of Mrs. Gardiner's former residence, and where she had lately returned, that some acquaintance still remained, they bent their steps, having seen all the principal wonders of the county, and within 5 miles of Lambton. Elizabeth found, from her aunt, that Pemberley was situated... Well, no, Pemberley was situated. It was not in their direct road, nor more than a mile or 2 out of it. In taking over their route the evening before, Mrs. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the place again. Mr. Gardiner declared his willingness, and Elizabeth was applied to for her approbation. My love, should not you like to see the place of which you have heard so much? Said her aunt. A place, too, with which so many of your acquaintance are connected. Wickham passed all his youth here, you know. Elizabeth was distressed. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley, and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. She must own that she was tired of great houses after going over so many. She really had no pleasure in fine carpets or satin curtains. Mrs. Gardiner abused her stupidity. "If it were merely a fine house, richly furnished," said she, "I should not care about it myself. But the grounds are delightful, and they have some of the finest woods in the country." Elizabeth said no more, but her mind could not acquiesce. The possibility of meeting Mr. Darcy while viewing the place instantly occurred. It would be dreadful. She blushed at the very idea, and thought it would be better to speak openly to her aunt than to run such a risk. But against this were objections, and she finally resolved that it could be the last resource if her private inquiries as to the absence of her family were unfavourably answered. Accordingly, when she retired at night, she asked the chambermaid whether Pemberley were not a very fine place, what was the name of its proprietor, and, with no little alarm, whether the family were down for the last summer. A most welcome negative followed the last question, and her alarms being now removed, she was at leisure to feel a great deal of curiosity to see the house herself, and when the subject was revived the next morning, she was a line applied to it, could readily answer, and with a proper air of indifference, that she had not really any dislike to the scheme. To Pemberley, therefore, they were to go. So Pemberley, I believe, is Mr. Darcy's house, basically. It's the estate that they live in. Or was Pemberley the estate that Mr. Bingley lived in? I'm not sure, but let's check it out, shall we? Conjecturing as to the date. We'll find out. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of the Pemberley woods, with some perturbation, and when at length they turned at the lodge, her spirits were in a high flutter. The park was very large, and contained great variety of ground. They entered it in one of its lowest points, and drove for some time through a beautiful wood stretching over a wide extent. Elizabeth's mind was so full for conversation, but she saw and admired every remarkable spot and point of view. They gradually ascended for half a mile, and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased, and her eyes was instantly caught by Pemberley House, situated on the opposite side of the valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building, standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high woody hills, and in front of a stream of some natural importance was swelled into greater, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formally nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. She had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. They were all of them warm in their admiration. At the moment she felt that to be mistress of Pemberley might be something. Hello, Sebastian, welcome. They descended the hill, crossed the bridge, and drove to the door, and, while examining the nearer aspect of the house, all her apprehensions of meeting its owner returned. She dreaded lest the chambermaid had been mistaken. On applying to see the place, they were admitted into its hall, and Elizabeth, as they waited for the housekeeper, had leisure to wonder at her being where she was. The housekeeper came, a respectable-looking elderly woman, much less fine and more civil than she had any notion of finding her. They followed her into the dining parlour. It was a large, well-proportioned room. Handsomely fitted up. Hello, Mad Apple, welcome. Elizabeth, after slightly surveying it, went to a window to enjoy its prospect. The hill, crowned with woods from which they had descended, receiving increased abruptness from the distance, was a beautiful object. Every disposition of the grounds was good, and she looked on the whole scene, the river, the trees scattered on its banks, and the winding of the valley, as far as she could trace it, with delight. As they passed into other rooms, these objects were taking different positions, but from every window there were beauties to be seen. The rooms were lofty and handsome, and their furniture suitable to the fortune of their proprietor. But Elizabeth saw, with admiration of his taste, that it was neither gaudy nor useless, fine with less of splendour, and more real elegance than the furniture of Rostings. And of this place, thought she, I might have been mistress. With these rooms I might have now been familiarly acquainted. Instead of viewing them as a stranger, I might have rejoiced in them being as my own, and welcomed them as visitors, my uncle and aunt. But no, recollecting herself, that could never be. My uncle and aunt would have been lost to me. I should not have been allowed to invite them. Tomorrow is pain ahead, perhaps, Brainy. I don't know. Tomorrow is tomorrow. Tomorrow is a mystery. I can't remember what I plan to stream tomorrow. I think, because I actually can stream tomorrow. It's the first Monday in a while I've been able to stream. Probably game dev. So probably pain, yes, for Red, not us though. This was a lucky recollection. It saved her from something like regret. Hello, Boris. Welcome. It is Monday. Tomorrow. 2 more days till what? Oh, do you mean Ruiner? Yes. We'll be doing more of that on Tuesday. She longed to inquire of the housekeeper whether her master was really absent, but had not courage for it. At length, however, the question was asked by her uncle, and she turned away with alarm, while Mrs. Reynolds, surprised that he was, adding, "But we expect him tomorrow, with a large party of friends." How rejoiced was Elizabeth that their own journey had not, by any circumstances, been delayed a day! Yay! Her aunt now called her to look at a picture. She approached and saw the likeness of Mr. Wickham, suspended amongst several other miniatures, over the mantelpiece. Her aunt asked her, smilingly, how she liked it. The housekeeper came forward and told them it was a picture of a young gentleman, the son of her late master's steward, who had been brought up by him at his own expense. Were you not already subscribed, Mad Apple? I assumed you were, but thank you anyway for subscribing. Yay! Why is there 2 things? Has it always been like that and I've only just noticed? Oh well. He has now gone into the army, she added, but I'm afraid he has turned out very wild. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece with a smile, but Elizabeth could not return it. Different account since I changed my main account to my real name for work-related stuff. Oh, fair dues. And that, said Mrs. Reynolds, pointing to another of the miniatures, is my master, and very like him. It was drawn at the same time as the other, about 8 years ago. I have heard much of your master's fine person, said Mrs. Gardiner, looking at the picture. It is a handsome face, but Lizzie, you can tell us whether it is like or not. Mrs. Reynolds' respect for Elizabeth seemed to increase on this imitation of her knowing her master. Does that young lady know Mr. Darcy? Oh, does she now? Better for you because I get an extra sub. Yes, I'm very happy with that. Thank you very much. Elizabeth coloured and said, "A little." "And do you not think him a very handsome gentleman, ma'am?" "Yes, very handsome." "I am sure I know none so handsome, but in the gallery upstairs you will see a finer, larger picture of him than this. This room was my late master's favourite room, and these miniatures are just as they used to be then. He was very fond of them." This accounted to Elizabeth for Mr. Wickham's being among them. Mrs. Reynolds then directed their attention to one of Miss Darcy, drawn when she was only 8 years old. "And is Miss Darcy as handsome as her brother?" said Mr. Gardiner. "Oh, yes, the handsomest young lady that ever was seen, and so accomplished. She plays and sings all day long. In the next room is the new instrument just come down for her, a present from my master. She comes here tomorrow with him." Mr. Gardiner, whose manners were easy and pleasant, encouraged her communicativeness by his questions and remarks. Mrs. Reynolds, either from pride or attachment, had evidently great pleasure in talking of her master and his sister. "Is your master much at Pemberley in the course of the year?" Not so much as I could wish, sir, but I dare say he may spend half his time here, and Miss Darcy is always down for the summer months." "Except," thought Elizabeth, "when he goes to Ramsgate." "If your master would marry, you might see more of him." "Yes, sir, I do not know when that will be. I do not know who is good enough for him." Elizabeth is good enough for him. Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner smiled. Elizabeth could not help saying, "It is very much to his credit, I am sure, that you should think so." "I say no more than the truth, and what everybody will say that knows him," replied the other. Elizabeth thought this was going pretty far, and she listened with increasing astonishment as the housekeeper added, "I've never had a cross word from him in my life, and I have known him ever since he was 4 years old." This was praise of all others most extraordinary, most opposite of her ideas. That he was not a good-tempered man had been her firmest opinion. Her keenest attention was awkward. She longed to hear more, and was grateful to her uncle for saying, "There are very few people of whom so much can be said. You are lucky in having such a master." "Yes, sir, I know I am. If I were to go through all the world, I could not meet with a better. But I have always observed that they are good-natured when children, are good-natured when they grow up. And he was always the sweetest, tempered, most generous-hearted boy in the world." Elizabeth almost stared at her. "Can this be Mr. Darcy?" thought she. "His father was an excellent man," said Mrs. Gardiner. "Yes, ma'am, that he was indeed, and his son will be just like him, just as affable to the poor." Elizabeth listened, wondered, doubted, and was impatient for more. Mrs. Reynolds could interest her on no other point. She related the subjects of the pictures, the dimensions of the rooms, and the price of the furniture in vain. Mr. Gardiner, highly amused by the kind of family prejudice to which he attributed her excessive commendation of her master, soon led again to the subject, and she dwelt with energy on many of his merits. As they proceeded together up the great staircase, "He was such a little angel growing up. We don't know what went wrong." "He is the best landlord and the best manager," said she, "that ever lived. Not like the wild young men nowadays, who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants but that will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men." "In what an amiable light does this place him?" thought Elizabeth. "This fine account of him," whispered her aunt as they walked. "Is it not quite consistent with his behaviour to our poor friend? Perhaps we might be deceived. That is not very likely. Your authority was good." On reaching the spacious lobby above, they were shown into a very pretty sitting room, lately filled up with greater elegance and lightness than her apartments below, and were informed that it was but just done to give pleasure to Miss Darcy, who had taken a liking to the room when last at Pemberley. "He's certainly a good brother," said Elizabeth as she walked towards one of the windows. Mrs. Reynolds anticipated Miss Darcy's delight when she should enter the room, "and this is always the way with him," she added. "Whatever he can give his sister any pleasure is sure to be done in any moment. There is nothing he would not do for her." The picture gallery and 2 or 3 of the principal bedrooms were all that remained to be shown. In the former were many good paintings, but Elizabeth knew nothing of art, and from such as had been already visible below, she had willingly turned to look at some drawings of Miss Darcy in crayons, whose subjects were usually more interesting and also more intelligible. In the gallery there were many family portraits, but they could not have little to fix the attention of a stranger. Elizabeth walked on in quest of the only face whose features would be known to her. At last it arrested her, and she beheld a striking resemblance of Mr. Darcy, with such a smile over the face as she remembered to have seen sometimes, when he looked at her. She stood several minutes before the picture, in earnest contemplation, and returned to it again before they quitted the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds informed them that it had been taken in his father's lifetime. There was certainly, at this moment, in Elizabeth's mind, a more gentle sensation towards the original than she had ever felt in the height of their acquaintance. The commendation bestowed on him by Mrs. Reynolds was no trifling nature. What praise is more valuable than the praise of an intelligent servant? As a brother, a landlord, a master, she considered how many people's happiness were in his guardianship, how much of a pleasure or pain it was in his power to bestow, how much good or evil must be done by him. Every idea that had been brought forward by the housekeeper was favourable to his character, and as she stood before the canvas on which he was represented and fixed his eyes upon herself, she thought of his regard with a deeper sentiment of gratitude than it had ever raised before. She remembered its warmth, and softened its impropriety of expression. When all of the house was open to the general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs and, taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. "I want them to get there a day early. Get there a day early, Darcy." "Come on, Darcy." As they walked across the lawn towards the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again. Her uncle and aunt also stopped, and while the former was conjecturing as to the date of the building, the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road which led behind the stables. They were within 20 yards of each other, and so abrupt was his appearance that it was impossible to avoid his sight. Their eyes instantly met, and the cheeks of each were overspread with the deepest blush. "Oh my!" He absolutely stared, and for a moment seemed immovable from surprise, but shortly recovering himself, advanced towards the party and spoke to Elizabeth, if not in terms of perfect composure, at least perfect civility. Can you imagine that? You get home from like a long journey and the woman who rejected you is in your house. The woman you proposed to is just wandering around your house. Oh God. She had instinctively turned away, but stopping on his approach, received his compliments with an embarrassment impossible to overcome. Had his first appearance or his resemblance to the picture they had just been examining been insufficient to ensure the other two, they had now saw Mr. Darcy, the gardener's expression of surprise on beholding his master must immediately have told it. They stood a little aloof while he was talking to their niece, who, astonished and confused, scarcely dared to lift her eyes to his face, and knew not what answer she returned to his civil inquiries after her family. Amazed at the alteration of his manner since they last parted, every sentence that he uttered was increasing her embarrassment, and every idea of the impropriety of her being found there recurring to her mind. The few minutes in which they continued together were some of the most uncomfortable in her life. I may have said no to you specifically, but I never said no to your estate. Not wrong. Nor did he seem much more at ease. When he spoke, his accent had none of its usual sedatedness, and he repeated his inquiries as to the time of her having left Longbourn, and of her stay in Derbyshire so often, and in so hurried a way as plainly spoke the distraction of his thought. Bless! Is my fiancé still taken? Yes, very much so. Still very much taken. At length, every idea seemed to fail him, and after standing a few moments without saying a word, he suddenly recollected himself and took leave. Oh, hi, why are you doing it? Okay, cool, how long have you been here? And, how long have you been here? And I'm going now. Oh, this is wonderful. The others then joined her, and expressed their admiration of his figure, but Elizabeth heard not a word, and wholly engrossed by her own feelings, followed them in silence. She was overpowered by shame and vexation. Her coming there was the most unfortunate, the most ill-judged thing in the world. How strange must it appear to him! In what a disgraceful light might it not strike so vain a man? It might seem as if she had purposely thrown herself in his way again. Oh, why did she come? Or why did he thus come a day before he was expected? Had they been only 10 minutes sooner, they should have been beyond the reach of his discrimination, for it was plain that he had that moment arrived, that moment alighted his horse or his carriage. She blushed again and again over the perverseness of the meeting, and his behaviour so strikingly altered. What could it mean? That he should even speak to her was amazing, but to speak with such civility, to inquire after her family. Never in her life had she seen his manners so little dignified. Never had he spoken with such gentleness as on this unexpected meeting. What a contrast did it offer to his last address in Rostings Park, when he put his letter in her hand. She knew not what to think, nor how to account for it. Vexation is another word we need to bring back. Yes, it is. We brought back yapping. Yapping's like an old word that for some reason has reared its head again. Vexation maybe should be the next one. Oh Lord, she vexed. Maybe something like that. Maybe not vexation as a whole word, but vexed, definitely. They had now entered a beautiful walk by the side of the water, and every step was bringing forward a nobler fall of ground, or a finer reach of wood to which they were approaching. But it was some time before Elizabeth was sensible of any of it. No worries, bro, butter. That's the book. You read the currently reading, you found it. And though she answered mechanically to the repeated appeals of her uncle and aunt, and seemed to direct her eyes to such objects as they pointed out, she distinguished no part of the scene. Her thoughts were all fixed on that one spot of Pemberley House, whichever it might be, wherever Mr. Darcy then was. She longed to know what at the moment was passing in his mind, in what manner he thought of her, and whether, in defiance of everything, she was still dear to him. Perhaps he had been civil only because he felt himself at ease. Yet there had been that in his voice which was not like ease. Whether he had felt more pain or pleasure in seeing her, she could not tell, but he certainly had not seen her with composure. At length, however, the remarks of her companions on her absence of mind roused her, and she felt the necessity of appearing more like herself. They entered the woods, and, bidding adieu to the river for a while, ascended some of the higher grounds, whence in spots where the opening of the trees gave the eye power to wander, were many charming views of the valley, the opposite hill, with the long range of woods overspreading many, and occasionally part of the stream. Mr. Gardiner expressed a wish of going round the whole park, but feared it might be beyond a walk. With a triumphant smile they were told that it was 10 miles round. It settled the matter, and they pursued the accustomed circuit, which brought them again, after some time in descent among hanging woods, to the edge of the water and one of its narrowest parts. They crossed it by a simple bridge, in character with the general air of the scene. It was a spot less adorned than any they had visited, and the valley here contracted into a glen. Contracted into a glen. I thought that was wrong. Contracted into a glen, allowed room only for the stream, and a narrow walk amidst the rough copperpiece wood which bordered it. Elizabeth longed to explore its windings, but when they had crossed the bridge and perceived their distance from the house, Mrs. Gardiner, who was not a great walker, could go no farther, and thought only of returning to the carriage as quickly as possible. Her niece was, therefore, obliged to submit, and they took their way towards the house on the opposite side of the river, in the nearest direction. But their progress was slow, for Mr. Gardiner, though seldom able to indulge the taste, was very fond of fishing, and was so much engaged in watching the occasional appearance of some trout in the water, and talking to the man about them, that he advanced but little. Whilst wandering on in this slow manner, they were again surprised, and Elizabeth's astonishment was quite equal to what it had been at first, by the sight of Mr. Darcy approaching them. Oh God, he's back. Poor Elizabeth, she just got her head together. And at no great distance. The walk, being here less sheltered than the other side, allowed them to see him before they met. Elizabeth, however astonished, was at least more prepared for an interview than before, and resolved to appear and to speak with calmness, if he really intended to meet with them. The passive ick aura is bountiful. This isn't even ick, this is more just like, oh God, this man who tried to marry me, who I may have gotten the wrong end of the stick with. He might actually be so much nicer than I think he is, he's just very abrasive. For a few moments, indeed, she felt that he would probably strike into some other path. The idea lasted while a turning in the walk concealed him from their river. The turning past, he was immediately before them. With a glance she saw that he had lost none of his recent civility, and, to imitate his politeness, she began, as they met, to admire the beauty of the place. but she had not got beyond the words delightful and charming, when some unlucky recollections obtruded, and she fancied that praise of Pemberley from her might be mischievously construed. Oh yeah, she did kind of insult his money and everything before, so yeah, it might be a little weird. Her colour changed, and she said no more. Mrs. Gardiner was standing a little behind, and on her pausing, he asked if she would do him the honour of introducing him to her friends. This was a stroke of civility for which she was quite unprepared, and she could hardly suppress a smile at him being now seeking the acquaintance of some of those very people against whom his pride had revolted in his offer himself. What will be his surprise, thought she, when he knows who they are? He takes them now for people of fashion. The introduction, however, was immediately made, and as she named their relation to herself, she stole a sly look at him, to see how he bore it, and was not without the expectation of his decamping as fast as he could from such disgraceful companions. That he was such surprised by the connection was evident. He sustained it, however, with fortitude, and, so far from going away, turned back with them, and entered into conversation with Mr. Gardiner. Elizabeth could not be pleased, could not be triumph. It was consoling that he should know she had some relations for whom there was no need to blush. My aunt and uncle aren't embarrassing, okay? I like being around them. She listened most attentively to all that passed between them, and gloried in every expression, every sentence of her uncle which marked his intelligence, his taste, or his good manners. The conversation soon turned upon fishing, and she heard Mr. Darcy invite him, with the greatest civility, to fish here as often as he chose, while he continued in the neighbourhood, offering at the same time to supply him with fishing tackle, and pointing out those parts of the stream where there was usually most sport. Mrs. Gardiner, who was walking arm in arm with Elizabeth, gave her a look of excessive wonder. Elizabeth said nothing, but it gratified her exceedingly. The compliment must be all for herself. Her astonishment, however, was extreme, and continually was repeating, "Why is he so altered? From what can it proceed? It cannot be for me. It cannot be for my sake that his manners are thus softened. My reproofs at Hunsford could not work such change as this. It is impossible that he should still love me." No, it's not. He still loves you, lady. He still loves you. You might have insulted him, but he still loves you. But he loves you more for it, because you stick to your guns, because you're such a strong lady. Elizabeth! After walking some time in this way, the two ladies in front, the two gentlemen behind, on resuming their places, after descending to the brink of the river for the better inspection of some curious water plant, there chanced to be a little alteration. It originated in Mrs. Gardiner, who, fatigued by the exercise of the morning, found Elizabeth's arm quite inadequate to her support, and consequently preferred her husband's. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. Oh, God. Okay, so the aunt is better than her mother. At least when she is trying to be a wing woman, she's subtle about it. And doesn't endanger her child's health. Mr. Darcy took her place by her niece, and they walked on together. After a short silence, the lady spoke first. She wished him to know that she had been assured of his absence before she came to the place, and accordingly began by observing that his arrival had been very unexpected. "For your housekeeper," she added, "informed us that you would certainly not be here till tomorrow. And indeed, before we left Bakewell, we understood that you were not immediately expected in the country." Country. I really don't know which one's which when it comes to spelling. He acknowledged the truth of it all, and said that business with his steward had occasioned his coming forward a few hours before the rest of the party, with whom he had been travelling. They will join me early tomorrow, he continued, and among them are some who will claim an acquaintance with you, Mr. Bingley and his sisters. I sure hope that man is still single, because there is a woman that wants him. Elizabeth answered only by a slight bow. Her thoughts were instantly driven back to the time when Mr. Bingley's name had been mentioned last between them, and if she might judge from his complexion, his mind was not very differently engaged. There is also one other person in the party, he continued after a pause, who more particularly wishes to be known to you. Will you allow me, or do I ask too much, to introduce my sister to your acquaintance during your stay at Lambden? The surprise of such an application was great indeed. It was too great for her to know in what manner she ascended to it. She immediately felt that whatever desire Miss Darcy might have of being acquainted with her must be the work of her brother, and without looking farther it was satisfactory. It was gratifying to know that his resentment had not made him think really ill of her. They now walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Elizabeth was not comfortable. That was impossible. She was flattered and pleased. His wish of introducing his sister to her was a compliment of the highest kind. They soon outstripped the others, and when they reached the carriage, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner were half a quarter mile behind. Mrs. Gardiner's slowing her husband down. He then asked her to walk into the house, but she declared herself not tired, and they stood together on the lawn. At such time much might have been said, and silence was very awkward. She wanted to talk, but there seemed an embargo on every subject. At least she recollected herself that she had been travelling, and they talked of Matlock and Dovedale with great perseverance. Yet time and her aunt moved slowly, and her patience and her ideas were nearly worn out before the tete-a-tete was over. On Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner coming up, they were all pressed to go into the house and take some refreshment, but this was declined, and they parted on each side with the utmost politeness. Mr. Darcy handed the ladies into the carriage, and when it drove off, Elizabeth saw him slowly walking towards the house. The observations of her uncle and auntie now began, and each of them pronounced him to be indefinitely superior to anything they had expected. He is perfectly well behaved, polite, and unassuming, said her uncle. There is something a little stately about him, to be sure, replied her aunt, but it is confined to his air, and not unbecoming. I now say with the housekeeper that though some people may call him proud, I have seen nothing of it. We've seen plenty of it. I was never more surprised by his behaviour to us. It was more civil. It was really attentive, and there was no necessity for such attention. His acquaintance with Elizabeth was very trifling. To be sure, Lizzie, said her aunt, he is not so handsome as Wickham, or rather he has not Wickham's countenance, for his features are perfectly good. But how came you to tell us that he was so disagreeable? Elizabeth excused herself as well as she could, said that she had liked him better when they met in Kent than before, and that she had never seen him so pleasant as this morning. But perhaps he may be a little whimsical in his civilities, replied her uncle. Your great men often are, and therefore I shall not take him at his word about fishing, and he might change his mind another day, and warn me off the grounds. Elizabeth felt that they had entirely mistaken his character, but said nothing. "From what we have seen of him," continued Mrs. Gardiner, "I really should not have thought that he could have been behaved in so cruel a way by anybody as he has done by poor Wickham. He has not an ill-natured look. On the contrary, there is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks, and there is something of dignity in his countenance that would not give one unfavourable idea of his heart. But, to be sure, the good lady who showed us the house did give him a most flaming character. I could hardly help laughing aloud sometimes. But he is a liberal master, I suppose, and that, in the eye of a servant, comprehends every virtue." Sorry, 1 minute. Poor Elizabeth. Her relatives don't have the full measure of Darcy. No, they haven't seen him sass. They've just seen him be polite in front of his crush's relations. Elizabeth here felt herself called on to say something in vindication of his behaviour to Wickham, and therefore gave them to understand, in as guarded a manner as she could, that by what she had heard from his relations in Kent, his actions were capable of a very different construction, and that his character was by no means so faulty, nor Mr. Wickham so admirable as they had been considered in Hertfordshire. In confirmation of this, she related the particulars of all the pecuniary transactions in which they had been connected, without actually naming her authority, or stating it to be such as might be relied on. Mrs. Gardiner was surprised and concerned, but as they were now approaching the scene of her former pleasures, every idea gave way to the charm of recollection, and she was too much engaged in pointing out to her husband all the interesting spots in its environs to think of anything else. Fatigued as she had been by the morning's walk, they had no sooner dined than she set off again in quest of her former acquaintance, and the evening was spent in the satisfactions of an intercourse renewed after many years of discontinuance. Wait, does that mean they boned? I don't know. No, they're talking about intercourse as a conversation, isn't it? So she went to go find someone that she spoke to, that she used to know in town, and they had a conversation after a long while. That's what it means. I wasn't sure if it just meant her and her husband had a dry patch for a hot minute, but this is fine. The occurrences of the day were too full of interest to leave Elizabeth much attention for any of these new friends, and she could do nothing but think and think with wonder of Mr. Darcy's civility, and above all, of his wishing her to be acquainted with his sister. Elizabeth had settled that Darcy would bring his sister to visit her the very day after her reaching Pemberley, and was consequently resolved not to be out of sight of the inn for the whole of that morning. But her conclusion was false, for on the very morning after their own arrival at Lambton, these visitors came. It'd be great if Victorians just casually used boning in their everyday talk. Nah, they probably had like worse and dirtier slang for boning. I mean, what's the one? Shakespeare. Shakespeare's a bit too old for Victorian. Oh, was he Victorian? Yeah, he is Elizabethan. He was after Victoria. Yeah, just before Victoria. But what was it? The beast with two backs. They had probably much dirtier ways of talking about boning than saying boning. They had been walking about the place with some of their new friends, and were just returned to the inn to dress themselves for dining with the same family, when the sound of a carriage drew them to a window, and they saw a gentleman and lady in circulate driving up the street. Elizabeth immediately recognised the livery, guessed what it meant, and imparted no small degree of surprise to her relations by acquainting them with the honour which she expected. Her uncle and aunt were all amazed, and the embarrassment of her manner as she spoke, joined to the circumstances itself, and many of the circumstances of the preceding day, opened them to a new idea of the business. Nothing had ever suggested it the day before, but they now felt that there was no other way of accounting for such attentions from such a quarter than by supposing a partiality for their niece. Wasn't ready for that phrase. What? It's a description of a monster, totally. Yeah, there's nothing weird about that. Nothing weird about that at all. Good old Shakespeare. Dirty bastard. While these newly born notions were passing in their heads, the perturbation of Elizabeth's feelings was every moment increasing. She was quite amazed at her own discomposure, but amongst other causes of disquiet, she dreaded lest the partiality of the brother should have said much in her favour, and more than commonly anxious to please, she naturally suspected that every power of pleasing would fail her. Oh no, she's super nervous about meeting his sister. She retreated from the window, fearful of being seen, and was, as she walked up and down the room, endeavouring to compose herself, saw such looks of inquiring surprise in her uncle and aunt as made everything worse. Oh God, poor woman. Miss Darcy and her brother appeared, and this formidable introduction took place. Formidable introduction. That is a great description of meeting the other half's parents, isn't it? This is a formidable introduction. A boss fight introduction. With astonishment did Elizabeth see that her new acquaintance was at least as much embarrassed as herself. Since her being at Lambton, she had heard that Miss Darcy was exceedingly proud, but the observation of a very few minutes convinced her that she was only exceedingly shy. She found it difficult to obtain even a word from her beyond a monosyllable. Okay, so I have a story about meeting your parents, your partner's parents. Go for it. Tell me the story while I tell you a story. Story for a story. I think that's a good trade. Miss Darcy was tall and on a larger scale than Elizabeth, and though little more than 16, her figure was formed, and her appearance womanly and graceful. She was less handsome than her brother, but there was sense and good humour in her face, and her manners were perfectly assuming and gentle. It's so wild. I want to point, whenever there's descriptions of people, it's not like we do descriptions now, where we go into specifics of, hair colour and eye colour, and whether something is a bit chunky or thin or gaunt or anything like that. These words don't really must have meant something to people at the time when it came to descriptions of appearance. But really, what is sense and good humour in her face? What does that mean? What did that mean to them back in the day? Did that mean she had a cute face? I don't know. Fascinating. Maybe these are some descriptive words we should bring back too. She's got so much sense and good humour. She has a goofy face. Do you think that's what it means? She has sense and good humour? I mean, good humour would be a goofy face, technically, yes. But no, I just find that fascinating. There has not been even a single description of people's physical appearances. It's more the feeling you get from them rather than what you're actually seeing, which is fascinating. It's a fascinating way of writing it. Elizabeth, who had expected to find her as acute and unembarrassed an observer as ever Mr. Darcy had been, was much relieved by discerning such different feelings. Oh, yes, here's the story. This was 8 years ago, and we got picked up by my partner's parents at the mall in winter night. That was my first time meeting them, and being introduced as the BF. We had already been dating for 6 months. I basically got interviewed on the car ride home. Oh no, that's the worst. You're trapped. You can't just go, oh, I need the toilet a minute to give yourself a break. You're trapped in the car. Oh gosh. I'm glad you survived. Vibe-based description. It is. It's 100%. No, they say aura now, don't they? The kids say aura. Aura points and things now. It is aura-based descriptions. Her aura is good, is sense and good humor, and womanly and graceful. I have no idea what an aura is. It's vibes. It's just another word for vibes, from what I understand. But hello, Asa, welcome. I mean, you could be weeing out the window. Wouldn't be a good one. Personally, I think aura is just more formal than vibes. It's just, aura is more formal, and I think I don't like that because of that. I think vibes are like nice and casual, and I kind of like that for it. I like it more because of that. But unspooky, it's becoming spooky month soon. Do you get more spooky when spooky month comes in? Or spooky. Unu spooky. Sorry, I got distracted by your name entirely then. It would be pretty weird though if I somehow met your partner's parents despite crossing the island. That would be weird. That would be incredibly weird. And you are Gen Z. Unus, like unus anus. Oh god, you just made me say that. Unus spooky. Unus spooky. Unus spooky. I missed one of the U's and was like, unspooky? You mean you make things not scary? Onya. Asa aura is invisible stink smell. Just smell less. You know, Dragon Ball Z or Naruto Chi, same thing. Clip that now! Don't clip that! Oh, no. We're reading a book now. We're reading a book, okay? What a great time to get an ad. Yes, normal size fandom, get an ad! Don't see what I just did. Anyway. Where was I? Oh, yes. They'd not been long together before Darcy told her that Bingley was also coming to wait on her, and she had barely time to express her satisfaction and prepare for such a visitor when Bingley's quick step was heard on the stairs, and in a moment he entered the room. All Elizabeth's anger against him had been long done away, but she had still felt any. It could hardly have stood its ground against the unaffected cordiality with which he expressed himself on seeing her again. He inquired in a friendly, though general way, after her family, and looked and spoke with the same good humour, ease that he had ever done. To Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner he was scarcely less interesting personage than to herself. They had long wished to see him. The whole party before them, indeed, excitedly a lively attention. The suspicions which had just arisen of Mr. Darcy and their niece directed their observations towards each with earnest, though guarded inquiry, and they soon drew from those inquiries the full conviction that one of them at least knew what it was to love. Of the lady's sensations there remained a little doubt, but that the gentleman was overflowing with admiration was evident enough. Oh, I see. Sounds like a law document. This is Pride and Prejudice, mofo. This is one of the most famous and influential novels in history, really. In case Pride deletes an episode. I won't delete it. I won't delete it. Just don't flag me. Elizabeth, on her side, had much to do. She wanted to ascertain the feelings of each of her visitors. She wanted to compose her own and to make herself agreeable to all. And in the latter object, were she feared most to fail, she was most sure of success. For those whom she endeavoured to give pleasure were prepossessed in her favour. Bingley was ready, Georgina was eager, and Darcy determined to be pleased. What kind of stories have I been reading? Currently this. I'm reading 3 other books right now. Yes, Bingley. Bingley is his real name. But welcome, maiden. Hello. I'm reading 3 books right now. I'm reading an isekai where a dude's been turned into a lady, a princess, and has to deal with all that. I'm reading Hello, I want to report Brady for being absolutely righteous. You can report me for that, I guess. I'm reading a comic book / novel thing, which is... I can't wait to show you that one once I've read it. I'm going to do a whole video on that. It's so cool. And I'm reading a kind of weird fantasy where people are very bad to their children. And Bingley was his namely. In seeing Bingley, her thoughts naturally flew to her sister, and oh, how ardently did she long to know whether any of his were directed in a like manner. Sometimes she could fancy that he talked less on former occasions, and once or twice pleased herself with the notion that, as he looked at her, he was trying to trace a resemblance. But, though this might be imaginary, she could not be deceived as to his behaviour to Miss Darcy, who had been sent up as a rival to Jane. No look appeared on either side that spoke particular regard. Nothing occurred between them that could justify the hopes of his sister. On this point she was soon satisfied, and 2 or 3 little circumstances occurred ere they parted, which, in her anxious interpretation, denoted a recollection of Jane, not unticuted by tenderness, and a wish of saying more than might to the mention of her, had he dared. He observed to her at a moment when the others were talking together, and in a tone which had something of real regret, that it was a very long time since he had the pleasure of seeing her. And before she could reply, he added, "It is above 8 months. We have not met since the 26th of November, when we were all dancing together at Netherfield." Elizabeth was pleased to find his memory so exact, and he afterwards took occasion to ask her, when unattended by all the rest, whether all her sisters were at Longbourn. Oh my, he is interested. He is interested. Thank you for the follow, pancakes. Challenge. Bry tries to make Pride and Prejudice novel into a children's book. Less text and more pictures, but still keeps the plot. Doable. 100% doable. Challenge accepted. Pride and Prejudice. Kids edition. Challenge written down so I don't forget it. Happy Pride, not month. Happy Pride and not Prejudice. There was not much in the question, nor in the preceding remark, but there was a look and a manner which gave them meaning. It was not often that she could turn her eyes on Mr. Darcy himself, but whether she did catch a glimpse, she saw an expression of general complacence, and in all that he said, she heard an accent so far removed from a hauteur or disdain of his companions, as convinced her that the improvement of his manners, which she had yesterday witnessed, however temporary its existence might prove, had at least outlived one day. When she saw him thus seeking the acquaintance and courting the good opinion of people with whom any intercourse a few months would have been a disgrace. When she saw him thus civil not only to herself but to the very relations whom he had openly disdained, and recollected their past livery seen in Hunsford Parsonage, the change was so great, and struck so forcibly on her mind, that she could hardly restrain her astonishment from being visible. Never, even in the company of his dear friends at Netherfield, or his dignified relations at Rostings, had she seen him so delirious, so pleased, so free from his self-consequence or unbending reserve, as now, when no importance could result from the success of his endeavours, and when even the acquaintance of those to whom his attentions were addressed would draw down the ridicule and censure of the ladies of both Netherfield and Rostings. Their visitors stayed with them above half an hour, and when they arose to depart, Mr. Darcy called on his sister to join him in expressing their wishes of seeing Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner and Miss Bennet to dinner at Pemberley before they left the county. Miss Darcy, though with a difference which marked her little in the habit of giving invitations, readily obeyed. Mrs. Gardiner looked at her niece, delirious of knowing how she, whom the invitation most concerned, felt disposed as to its acceptance. But Elizabeth had turned away her head, presuming, however, that this studied avoidance spoke rather a momentary embarrassment than any dislike of the proposal, and seeing in her husband, who was fond of society, a perfect willingness to accept, she ventured to engage for her attendance, and the day after the next was fixed on. Bingley expressed great pleasure in the certainty of seeing Elizabeth again, having still a great deal to say to her, and many inquiries to make after all their Hertfordshire friends. Elizabeth, constructing all this into a wish of hearing her speak of her sister, was pleased, and, on this account, as well as some others, found herself, when their visitors had left, capable of considering the last half an hour with some satisfaction, though, while it was passing, the enjoyment of it had been little. Eager to be alone, and fearful of inquiries or hints from her uncle and aunt, she stayed with them only long enough to hear their favourable opinion of Bingley, and then hurried away to dress. She had no reason to fear Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner's curiosity. It was not their wish to force her communication. It was evident that she was much better acquainted with Mr. Darcy than they had before any idea of. It was evident that he was very much in love with her. They saw much to interest, but nothing to justify inquiry. Of Mr. Darcy it was now a matter of anxiety to think well, and as far as their acquaintance reached, there was no fault to find. They could not be untouched by his politeness, and had they drawn his character from their own feelings and his servant's report, without any reference to another, the circle in Hertfordshire to which he was known to would not have recognised it for Mr. Darcy. There was now an interest, however, in believing the housekeeper, and they soon became susceptible to the authority of a servant, who had known him since he was 4 years old, and whose own manners indicated respectability, was not to be hastily rejected. Neither had anything occurred in the intelligence of their Lambton friends that could materially lessen its weight. They had nothing to accuse him of but pride. Pride he probably had, and if not, it would certainly be impudent by the inhabitants of a small market town where the family did not visit. It was acknowledged, however, that he was a liberal man, and did much good among the poor. With respect to Wickham, the travellers soon found that he was not held there in much estimation, for though the chief of his concerns with the son of his patron were imperfectly understood, it was yet a well-known fact on his quitting Derbyshire he had left many debts behind him, when Mr. Darcy afterwards discharged. As for Elizabeth, her thoughts were at Pemberley this evening more than the last, and the evening, though as it passed it seemed long, was not long enough to determine her feeling towards one in the mansion, and she lay awake 2 whole hours endeavouring to make them out. She certainly did not hate him, no, hatred had vanished long ago, and she had almost as long been ashamed of ever feeling a dislike against him, that could be so called. The respect created by the conviction of his valuable qualities, though at first unwillingly admitted, had for some time ceased to be repugnant to her feelings, and it was now heightened into somewhat of a friendlier nature by the testimony so highly in his favour, and bringing forward his disposition in so amiable a light, which yesterday had produced. But above all, above respect and esteem, there was a motive within her of goodwill, which could not be overlooked. It was gratitude. Gratitude not merely for having once loved her, but for loving her still well enough to forgive all the petulance and acrimony of her manner in rejecting him, and all the unjust accusations accompanying her rejection. Oh no. They're trying to get you to order pizza. Don't be influenced. Don't do it. Unless you really actually want pizza, then do it. By all means, treat yourself if you actually want it. But don't do it. You have a lovely voice, by the way. Thank you. Appreciate it. He who had been persuaded would avoid her as his greatest enemies seemed, on his accidental meeting, most eager to preserve the acquaintance, and without any indelicate display of regard or any peculiarity of manner, were their two selves only concerned, was soliciting the good opinion of her friends, and bent on making her known to his sister. Such a change in a man of so much pride excited not only astonishment but gratitude, for to love, ardent love, it must be attributed, and as such, its impression on her was a sort to be encouraged, as by no means unpleasing, though it could not be exactly defined. She respected, she esteemed, she was grateful to him. She felt a real interest in his welfare, and she only wanted to know how far she wished that welfare to depend upon herself, and how far it would be for happiness of both that she should employ the power which her fancy told her she still possessed of bringing on the renewal of his address. Imagine listening to a British person reading an old romance novel while eating pizza. Sounds like a good time, honestly. You have a mini pizza you could have during the stream. It's not a Domino's pizza though, is it? You know, I think Domino's should sponsor you. My home state has a reading program where X number of books gets you a free pizza. Holy shit, I want that. That's great. I want that. I remember when I was younger, and the library would always have something going on in the summer holidays, like a summer reading list thing. And I remember one year it was like a sticker book, and you'd get a sticker every time you get a thing, and you'd have, it was like a little, it's cute. It was like a roller coaster, I think, and you get like a little bit of the roller coaster each time. It was very cute. Hello, Ray's cool, welcome. That does sound dope as heck. I would read for pizza, 100%. It had been settled in the evening between the aunt and niece that such a striking civility as Miss Darcy's in coming to them on the very day of her arrival at Pemberley, for she had reached it only to late breakfast, ought to be intimidated, though it could not be equally, by some exertion of politeness on their side, and consequently that would be highly expedient to wait on her at Pemberley the following morning. They were, therefore, to go. Elizabeth was pleased, though when she asked herself the reason, she had little to say in reply. Oh, Elizabeth. Oh, Elizabeth. Charity named Read for Pizza. Oh my god. I'm looking this up, 1 second. Because, I mean, if I get sponsored by Domino's, and we could do it a little sponsor. Read for Pizza. Is this real? Pizza Hut Book It program. Oh my gosh, this is, so there's a Pizza Hut program. It's real. Hello. Ripley? What's that name from? Ripley. Oh, Alien! And when it gets interrupted by a star railed and what the actual fajita. Oh, lordy. Just made one up. You can pretend it's from Alien. Alien's pretty cool. Sadly not from that. Just pretend it is. Just say it is. Gonna change that to books until pizza. Yeah, it should be books until pizza. You're right. Oh my gosh, I might look into this. The Pizza Hut Book It program. Oh my gosh. So you can get a free personal pan pizza. Access denied. The bookitprogram.com. So they must have taken it away. This isn't the amount of books I have. This is the amount I have to read before I am free of the library, which I fell into and I'm now trapped in. Ridley is the alien dragon from Metroid. I know, but Ripley is the person from thingy. Ridley is also the director of it, and yeah, I gotta read a lot. So reading some Pride and Prejudice today. What were we up to? I always get lost. Oh wait! I just realized the time. Should I keep calling you Ripley? Even if it has a different name on YouTube. But yes, welcome to the YouTube. Brad is giving up her freedom for delicious pizza. Yes, please. Okay, Ripley it is. How far have we got until the... Oh, we've only got a few pages for the next bit of chapter. Okay, well, we'll finish with this chapter then. And then we'll have to go. Hehehe. We're 69% of the way through. Nice. Funny internet number. Hehehe. Oh yeah, there we go. Mr. Gardner left them soon after breakfast. The fishing scheme had been renewed the day before, and a positive engagement made of his meeting some of the gentlemen at Pemberley by noon. Da-da-da. Da-da-da. They're gonna go fishing. Look at the gentlemen going fishing. And with that, you for 96 or 666. Unfortunately, we can't get 666%. However, 96 would be good. But we're only at 69% and we're 8 streams into this book. It's so fat. This is a fat book. But that is the end of my stream for today. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone in chat. Thank you to anyone who lurked. And thank you to anyone who watches the VOD. It was really nice. I saw some new faces today. It was lovely to see you guys. Thank you so much for dropping in. I really hope you enjoyed. And if you did, if you want to catch me again, you're best off, if you're on YouTube, pressing that subscribe button, the bell. I don't tell you to press the bell often. I should do that more often. And give it a like as well. I would really appreciate that. And if you're on the Twitch, if you could give it a follow over there as well, that would be lovely. Thank you. I can see some of you already have, so thank you so much for that. 10 out of 10. Good stuff. So next week is a bit of a funny week. I think tomorrow I'm going to put up my schedule for the next 2 weeks, because on Friday I'm going on holiday. I'm going away over the weekend, so I won't be able to stream on Friday. I won't be able to stream on Thursday because I'm at work, and I won't be able to stream on Sunday either. So we actually have Monday and Tuesday next week when it comes to streams. On Monday I'm going to do going to Blackpool. Just because I don't want to dox at all. I'm actually not going to say where I'm going till I get back. Happy vacay! Oh, it's going to be lovely. It's going to be lovely. I cannot wait. But, so I'll be streaming on Monday. And we'll do some game dev. That'll be fun. And Tuesday is Ruiner. So we'll have those 2 streams next week. Then the week after, I won't be able to stream Monday, and I won't be able to stream Tuesday. So we'll have Thursday, Friday, Sunday the week after. So I'll probably, like I said, I'll do the 2 schedules tomorrow. So keep an eye out on the Twitters, in the Discord, and on the YouTube community page for these schedules for the next couple of weeks. And then that way you'll kind of know what's coming up. But I will be back tomorrow with some game dev. We'll continue to work on Little Red and the Baba Yaga and the chaos that has been bringing me. I need to make sure I turn some things off because I've been working on some secret routes. And if you would like me to be able to, you know, stream more and not work as much, and one day be able to just only stream, that's the dream, that's the chaos, that's the dream, then there's many ways you can do that. You can get YouTube membership, where you get emotes, exclusive streams, Discord and merch discounts. You get the Patreon, where you can get pretty much all that, but you also get free books, and you get short stories every month. This month's short story was about space plesiosauruses. Yeah. Then there's the Kofi, where you don't get too much. I get emotes like those, show off them emotes. And then there's the Kofi, where in the Kofi shop there's like small audiobooks. So if you do like me, like telling you stories and listening to me tell you stories, the Kofi shop's the best place to go. And finally there is the merch store, where there are ebooks, first edition copies of books that I've written where you can't get them anywhere else. There are bookmarks, ski rings, t-shirts, a notebook, a pillow, and some stickers of said emotes. So there's a lot. Most of those links are in the description. The website, the merch store, is at www.bryonyrosesmith.co.uk. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for coming. Like I said, really happy to see some newer faces. It's lovely to see you guys. Lovely to meet new people. And thank you everyone who keeps coming as well. Thank you everyone in chat. Thank you anyone who lurked. Thank you anyone who watches the VOD. I really appreciate you coming and supporting me in whatever way you can. Have a fun vacay. Thank you. I will see you guys tomorrow. I had fun. I hope you had fun. This has been Brand New Smith, Light in the Forbidden Library. Good.